Let's pull things together. At this point in the story, the Ionian Revolt has failed, Miletus has fallen, the Persian fleet has reasserted control of the Aegean coastline, taxes have been reorganised and tyrannies removed, limited self-government has been granted to the Greek cities on the western coast of the Persian Empire under Persian supervision. Mardonius has overseen reforms that are measured and effective. From a narrow military perspective, Persia has won. But it is worth pausing here before we move on to the demand for earth and water to ask a question that Herodotus never quite spells out, but which governs everything that follows. Why does Persia now concern itself with mainland Greece at all? From a Persian point of view, Greece is peripheral. It's poor, it's divided, it's politically unstable, and until recently it's been strategically irrelevant. Persia has already subdued Lydia, Babylon, Egypt, the Ionian cities. Compared with these, Athens and Eretria are insignificant, and yet Persia does not forget them. This is not because Persian kings are vindictive, nor because they are obsessed with bringing an end to Greek freedom, nor because they harbour some imperialist dream of conquering Europe, though no doubt that is on their list of things to do in a rather vague sense. It is because empires cannot afford precedent. They certainly can't afford adverse precedent. The Ionian Revolt, taken by itself, is not the problem. Rebellions happen. They're expected. They're managed. What makes this revolt different is that external states have intervened. They've attacked a provincial capital and they've burned it and escaped. From an imperial point of view, that is intolerable. Persian rule rests on a simple deal offered to the ruled. Obedience is rewarded with autonomy and prosperity. Resistance is punished decisively and memorably. This is not cruelty for its own sake. This is not a rerun of the Assyrian Empire. It is deterrence. Athens, and to a lesser degree Eretria, another Greek city, have broken that logic. They have acted as if Persian power has limits, and worse, as if those limits can be tested without consequence. If this behaviour is allowed to stand, it will become a model. Other states may follow. Neutral states may hesitate. Subject peoples may re-evaluate their position within the Persian Empire. For Persia, therefore, Athens and Eretria must be dealt with, not out of anger, but out of policy. This is the first key point to understand before we move forward. The coming invasion is not an act of conquest, but an act of enforcement. It is closer to a police operation, or call it a special military operation, than to a war of annihilation. The distinction matters because it explains both the scale of the Persian response and its initial restraint. Herodotus gives a vivid image of King Darius being reminded of Athens 3 times at every meal. Modern readers often treat this as a sign of personal rage. It isn't. In Persian political culture, memory is policy. Kings rule vast territories not by constant presence, but by symbolic consistency. To forget an offence is to invite repetition. To remember it publicly is to reaffirm hierarchy. The burning of Sardis is not important because of the damage it caused. Cities burn. What matters is who burned it. Athens is not a subject state. Athens is an outsider that has interfered in imperial administration. That makes the Athenian actions qualitatively different from the Ionian rebellion. The Ionian Greeks are conquered, they're reorganized, they're reabsorbed. The mainland Greeks must be disciplined, and discipline in an imperial system must be visible. At this point, you may expect immediate retaliation, a great big army, overwhelming force, total conquest. But that is not how successful empires behave. Declining empires treat every challenge as an existential threat. They grow obsessed with not looking weak. They respond to every passing challenge with force. When that fails, they try greater force. They behave like a broken gambler. They become a danger to themselves and to every other state in reach. We've seen this twice in the past 100 years. We may see it now, though I do not choose to give names. But Persia is not a declining empire. Persia does not rush, it does not overreact, it does not mobilize the full resources of the empire to deal with two small cities on its fringe. It will not and cannot ignore what has happened, but it does not fall into paranoid hysterics. Instead, it prepares a limited expedition calibrated to its objectives. There are several reasons for this. First, Greece is geographically awkward. It's difficult to invade. It has mountains, narrow passes, fragmented coastlines. These all favour defenders. Persia has learned through experience elsewhere that terrain is important. Second, Persia does not yet believe that mainland Greece will resist in force. Most Greek states have shown themselves willing to submit when asked. Many already understand the logic of earth and water. Third, Persia expects Greek politics to do much of the work for it. Tyrannies can be restored, factions can be exploited, individual states can be isolated and picked off one by one. From this perspective, a large, slow-moving invasion would be unnecessary and counterproductive. What is required is demonstration, visible demonstration, not domination. This is where Hippias, the exiled tyrant of Athens, comes in useful. From a Greek point of view, Hippias is a traitor. From a Persian point of view, he is a solution. Persia has ruled Greek cities before. It has done so most effectively through local elites and tyrants who understand both Persian authority and Greek society. Hippias fits this pattern, fits it very well. He's experienced. He knows Athens and Attica and Greece. He has supporters. He offers the possibility of restoring order without prolonged occupation. Most important, Hippias's presence allows Persia to frame its intervention not as a foreign conquest, but as a legitimate restoration. This matters diplomatically. It allows neutral Greek states to reassure themselves that Persia is not attacking Greece as such, but merely correcting a specific offence and reinstating proper authority. I should at this point mention the earlier expedition of 492 under Mardonius. This is often treated as a false start, and I haven't so far mentioned it. It is worth mentioning. Militarily, it succeeds in subduing Thrace and in bringing Macedonia into Persian dependency. You can see by looking on the map of the Persian Empire that Persia is now deep into Europe and deep into northern Greece. That was the achievement of Mardonius. Strategically, it reveals a serious vulnerability, that is the dangers of sailing close to Mount Athos. The storm that destroys much of the Persian fleet in 492 is not a sign of divine displeasure, it is a logistical lesson. The Persians learn it. They do not abandon their plans, they refine them. The next expedition will avoid Athos. It will rely more heavily on naval mobility. It will move island by island, and it will secure bases and supply lines, and it will secure submission as it advances. This is adaptation. Perhaps the most important point to understand before we move on to the demand for earth and water is this. Greece does not matter very much to Persia. It matters symbolically. It matters administratively. It doesn't matter existentially. Athens, when the moment comes, will be fighting for survival. Persia will be enforcing order. This asymmetry of stakes explains almost everything that follows. It explains why Persia sends envoys in the first place rather than armies. It explains why submission is offered as a reasonable option. It explains why resistance, when it occurs, is punished selectively rather than indiscriminately. It also explains why the Persians are genuinely surprised when the Athenians say that they will resist to the end, and when they do. They don't understand, because they don't need to understand, how much is at stake for a fiercely autonomous city-state whose political identity is bound up with recent liberation from tyranny. It is against this background that we must now understand the next Persian move. Before armies march, envoys travel. Before battles are fought, choices are offered. The demand for earth and water is not an ultimatum born of arrogance. It is an administrative test, a way of distinguishing those who accept the logic of empire from those who reject it. Most Greek states will choose submission. 2 will not, and it is that refusal, not marathon, that makes the war what it becomes.